Good morning to everybody. I'm Sergio Sai of the University of Pisa, and I'm talking to you today of the life cycle assessment in the agricultural sector within the massive open online course of the SHARInG-MeD project. SHARInG-MeD is a project devoted to the soil health and agricultural resilience through an integrated geographical information systems of the Mediterranean drylands, and it's funded by the Partnership for Research and Innovation in the Mediterranean Area in the 2022. The life cycle assessment is an important tool in agriculture to understand the trade-off between agronomic benefits, production, and its environmental impact. Life cycle assessment is a big tool to understand how a system is impacting the environment, and this includes, from the one end, the direct environmental impact and also economic and social impact. In this lesson, we will notice that one of the main aspects for preserving agricultural productivity and fertility and reducing the environmental impact of agriculture is indeed reducing the use of the soil and the degradation of the soil while improving its fertility. Unfortunately, agriculture is one of the main reasons for soil use at a global level. This means that the way we use it and how we manage it can directly affect the environmental impact of the humankind on the whole global system. Thus, take into account that one of the most crucial aspects of the environmental impact is on biodiversity, and we need to preserve biodiversity. Unfortunately, biodiversity is strongly harmed by the conversion of soil from natural uses, for example, forest, to any managed uses, either agriculture or urban and industrial uses. When this conversion occurs, biodiversity dramatically reduces and the soil is being degraded. And this happens irrespective of the way we make agriculture. So simply converting soil from natural use to agricultural use can strongly affect agriculture and the environmental impact of agriculture. One of the main reasons is that higher animals, for example, some carnivores, requires an enormous amount of area to live. This is because they eat a lot of herbivore animals, and herbivore animals eat a lot of space. So in order to protect the higher animals, we need to have wide areas that can be used for natural uses. And indeed, one of the main reasons for biodiversity threat is the so-called hypostrategy, that is the habitat loss of the organisms, the presence of invasive species, the pollution, any kind of pollution, for example, from active ingredients used in agriculture, from any residues released from industrial or urban areas, and so on, the human population that provide a pressure on the environment, and the overharvesting of the natural resources that reduces the ability of the global environment to renew. In doing so, we have to consider that one of the peculiarities of the agroecosystems, so the cultivated systems, is indeed the use of inputs. The inputs is everything we put in the system, and this may be both actual material, just like seed, fertilizer, pesticides, or the use of machineries that are used into the agriculture and also uses energy. Frequently they use indeed fossil fuels, but we also add our time and our credit, so we make an investment on agriculture. Some of the agronomic key point on these aspects is that the most of these affect directly the soil, and the soil is the cornerstone of life, is the reservoir of the biodiversity, and it's the main tool to provide food production. The very most of crops in the world grow into the soil. The very most of calories produced at a global level comes from food produced in the soil. Directly or indirectly, these also include indeed the animal products that are produced by animals that frequently eat plants, forages grown into the soil. The soil can also uh, store water and can also filtrate water. And lastly, it's a crucial carbon storage point. That is that the carbon saved into the soil does not contribute to the global greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And the higher the amount of carbon that we can put into the soil, the more we can reduce the greenhouse gas emission. And indeed, at the one side, we must also reduce the carbon release from the soil to the atmosphere. In doing so, we have to consider that at a global level, only around 30% of the land covers the global area, and on this Earth's surface, only two-thirds of this is an habitable land, and out of this habitable land, around one half is used for agriculture, and unfortunately, only less than one half, a little bit more than one-third, is used for forest, and around the 11% for shrub and other kind of land uses. This means that agriculture is strongly competing with forest and shrubs for the land area. At the one time, we have to consider that more than 3/4 of the agricultural area is used for livestock meat and dairy production. We have to consider that a big amount of this 77% of the agricultural area is pasture, and the pasture cannot easily be converted in crop because in these conversions in many areas there is a strong release in greenhouse gas emission, and at the one time we don't have an increase in the global productivity of the area. This is because pastures are usually spread in area with low productivity that could not be used for cropland. In the past, there has been a strong conversion of pasture to cropland, but frequently this was accompanied by a reduced plant growth and production, and at the one time also to an enormous environmental degradation. And this trade-off may not be beneficial for the humankind. Well, let's consider that the very most of the biodiversity in the soil, in the earth, is into the soil. There are reports suggesting that the 50% of the global biodiversity is into the soil, and sometimes these reports span between 25 and 70% of the global biodiversity. In this can change depending on the area and soil management and so on. And a very strong fraction of this biodiversity is destroyed just by one tillage operation, especially that biodiversity that is composed by relatively big organisms, just like nematodes, annelids, and many insects into the soil. Well, indeed, some other organisms, just like fungi and bacteria, can be modified by the soil tillage, frequently also destroyed. And when we make this kind of operation, we are from the one end achieving some agronomic benefits because tillage improve the agronomic management, make it easier, but at the one time it is reducing the soil fertility. In doing so, let's consider that the soil should be considered as the cornerstone of the sustainability. So what's sustainability? Sustainability means maintaining a, an active process, allowing the next generation to perform it, so without reducing the amount of materials needed for that process and resources. Usually sustainability has been interpreted with three pillars: environmental, economic, and social aspects. But recently also the food security has been considered, and food security is indeed a social aspect, but it's crucial since in many areas of the world there is no security. Let's consider that food security simply means having food and healthy food, but both conditions must occur, both having it and having it healthy. In doing so, we must also consider that after the Second World War, indeed, the whole agriculture at a global extent has undergone strong changes. One of these was the use of synthetic fertilizers and active ingredients. This has been used with the two main aims. Synthetic fertilizers are used for providing the nutrients for the crops, and active ingredients to protect the crops from the pests, pathogens, and weeds. And this has produced indeed an enormous increase in the yield, but the use of these synthetic products has also consisted in an increase of the environmental impact per unit area. At the one end, during the last 70 or 80 years, we have also started using advanced breeding techniques, producing genotypes of plant species, of crops, that can better benefit of the nutrients provided, so increases their yield potential. They also increased their quality, but the strong use of these improved genotypes also consisted in a reduction of the use of many other species and genotypes, so that in the recent times the very most of the calories produced at a global level are produced by less than 10 species. Lastly, we started using farm machinery, especially tractors and all the tools used with the tractors. And these tools, especially tillage, has helped indeed a lot in the agronomic production, because tillage and many other tools have multiple effects. They stimulate the mineralization of the soil organic carbon, thus releasing nutrients for the crops, but at one time they reduce the soil organic carbon. Also, they reduce the chances of soil of acting as a sink for the atmospheric carbon, and they have enormously increased the environmental impact per unit areas. Most importantly, the tillage operations are within agriculture the main responsible of the sediment loss, so of soil erosion. And when we lose soil from the crops, we also lose soil organic carbon and nutrients. And if we have applied active ingredients, indeed these active ingredients move with the soil and usually reach the rivers, the lakes, and the sea, providing an additional environmental impact in those areas. Indeed, the use of the synthetic fertilizers and active ingredients has increased at a global level, but we must consider for active ingredients that at least since the last 40 or 50 years, their toxicity was enormously reducing by selecting new active ingredient with a lower toxicity. Also, the persistence has been reduced, so we keep applying active ingredients, but the ones that we applied are less toxic and less persistent in the environment. And we must also consider that the data that I have shown comes from the United States Department of Agriculture, and these indeed are similar to the data provided by the Food and Agriculture Administration while converting for the unit of measure indeed. Okay, now let's also consider that the increase in the yield due to the active ingredient was one of the increases of the yield achieved, and another big part of that increase is also due to the application of synthetic fertilizers. The synthetic fertilizers, and especially nitrogen-based fertilizers, are now responsible for saving among more or less 1/2 of the population at a global extent. This is because they increased yield at the one time. We had more food for the more persons in the world, and we could feed them. Also, while increasing yield, they also reduced the cost of production, thus allowing more persons to access the food. So they also had a social implication in everything. The combination of the improved genotypes with other techniques that I have already showed, just like the fertilization, has also provided additional benefits. From many experiments around the world, it has been shown that older genotypes perform not in a good way. So they usually produce a lot of biomass, but few grain, few yield, and so on, and newer genotypes are better performing, and this occurs irrespective of any changes in the amount of fertilizers applied. But indeed, when applying fertilizers, the newer genotypes also increases their performances, whereas the older genotypes are not able to take benefit of these inputs. In the nowadays agriculture, where inputs occurs, indeed it's important not simply adding inputs, but using genotypes which are able to use those inputs. At the one time, while increasing yield through genotypes, through fertilizers, through active ingredients, and also through tillage operation, we spared a high amount of land. Thus, if we don't use these tools, we should use more than the double of the land that we use, and we can only take this land from the forest or the shrubland, thus reducing biodiversity and degrading the soil. So right now we have to consider during this process, during this change, did we have a higher increase of the yield or a higher increase of the environmental impact? So once we used to have a given amount of area that produced a yield, for example, this may be 1 ton of grain from 1 hectare of soil, and indeed this production also produced a given environmental impact. Through this data, we can easily compute the environmental impact per unit yield. With the techniques of nowadays, we could also consider using less soils, but we must also compute which is the environmental impact in producing the same amount of grain in less soil, but also the environmental impact or environmental benefits of an alternative use of the spared soil. For example, if I produce the same amount of grain in 1/2 of the soil, can I use the other half to improve the environment, for example, to producing other kinds of crops, or to remove it from production and use it for forest land and so on? Thus, we must consider at the one time the amount of production obtained, the environmental impact from that land, and make this ratio. At the end, we must have the environmental impact per unit yield. This is because we use the yield. We are not aiming to use the soil. We use the soil only to have the yield, not for other reasons. So in other words, we must manage the sustainability of the world system, but let's consider that the sustainability does not simply imply the environmental sustainability, but also the economic and social impact of the practices that we apply. In doing so, let's remind that food security is a social impact that must be considered. And these must be considered at the plot, farm, landscape, nation, and global scales. So we need to define all these sustainability issues at various scales in order to be able to provide indications to the policymakers at various extent. And all of this must be done at one time. This needs that we can create a concerted measure of sustainability. Right now, there have been examples for the world food systems, and I want to remind that the world food systems also include that we have to consider the production in the field and any other transport and transformation throughout the value chain. And at the one time, we also have to consider the food use in the own houses or restaurants and so on, and also the disposal of the wastes. So all of these aspects were never measured in all the environments and nations, but indeed the very most of these aspects have been collected at various national levels, and there has been many economic, social, environmental and food security indicators for 97 nations by Benet et al. And they indicated right now only at national level areas which with less sustainability and area with more sustainability. As we can see, areas affected by strong food shortage, so low food security, are indicated as less sustainable, despite usually these areas have a higher environmental sustainability. This is because they have a lower pressure of the humankind on their environment, but they don't have the food. So providing food is a main aspect for food sustainability. How can we do it? We can do it through the life cycle assessment. There are indeed many other tools, but life cycle assessment tools are the more standardized one. And this standardization allow us to achieve similar results when applying the systems to different conditions or when applying it to the same conditions from different actors. Indeed, the life cycle assessment is not an exact measurement, it's a model, but it's a model that relies on direct collected data and can be used to have a very good information on the environmental impact of an area. And this life cycle assessment can also merge it with social analysis in the social life cycle assessment or costing analysis in the life cycle costing and provide a unique view of environmental, social, and economic impact. How is it done? For the food production, we split all the value chain in 6 aspects. That includes the production of the farm inputs, for example, the fertilizers or the active ingredients of the tractors, the use of fuel, and so on. The agricultural stage that include the use of these farm inputs, just like the tillage operation, the harvesting operation, the application of these fertilizers and their impact on the soil and in the environment. Then the production phase that after the agricultural phase takes the food produced by the farm and these foods are usually transformed. For example, wheat is transformed in flour and flour is transformed in bread, and so on. These products are also distributed, and thus we have an impact in the transport. At the end, these products are also used, and we have an impact in this part, and the waste should be managed. In all this process, we should try to improve circularity to reduce the impact of the waste management. Indeed, all these parts can also be analyzed separately at various scales. For example, from the agricultural point of view, it's crucial analyzing from the cradle to the farm gate. That includes mostly analyzing the farm inputs and the agricultural stage. After the farmers sell the ingredients that they have produced, for example, the wheat, the tomato, and so on, they are not responsible anymore of the impact that this food will produce in the production phase. But indeed, the production phase can come in various stages, and all these stages must be considered. As I mentioned before, wheat is milled to flour, and flour is transformed to bread. So these are two production aspects that must be separately considered, and the final result merged. And all these products, either partly or completely transformed, will be also distributed with various tools. At the one end, the use may have a variable impact depending on what we do in our house and when we do it. And lastly, the waste management as crucial aspects that depends on the nation and local conditions. So if we consider as the 100% of the impact that we have in all the value chain, the impact per unit area comes from the farm input and agricultural stage. And the impact of the first four issues is very well studied. So farm inputs, agricultural stage, production, and distribution have a very good information at a global level. Indeed, there are also integrated data and additional data on the use and waste management at various extent. To have these impacts, we should thus take into account the whole infrastructure and equipment used for the production. For example, we must consider the production of the fertilizers and the amount of fertilizers transported and then used per unit area, the production of seed, the production of pesticides, herbicides, and so on, the production of fuel, of lubricant, and everything else. When we use it in the cultivation phase, we must also consider that they have a direct impact, and so on. In doing so, we can split all the fluxes stage by stage, and in splitting them, we must also consider the actual use of the products. For example, when producing wheat, we can also have straw, and we can use the straw to feed livestock, or we can return it into the soil. And depending on what we do with the straw, we must consider its impact of its side value chain, if any. When doing so, we will directly measure a number of inputs provided in the system, and through these inputs, we will model the impact categories. These impact categories, according to the LCA, may be different and may include, for example, the production of particulate matter in the atmosphere, the toxicity for both human and animals, the water use, the impact in the water, and the global warming potential that strongly depends on the greenhouse gas emission, and so on. All of these impact categories are then merged in groups to have pathways of damages. Some of these, for example, may damage the respiratory system of the animals, including humans. Some of these can directly affect the fresh water or the salty water and so on. Some of these can simply increase the cost of production and so on. When we will have this endpoint in area of protection, we will have some main group of effect depending on the damage pathways that comes out from the impact categories. Now we must consider that in doing this inventory there is a need of being very precise. This is not easy in some systems, and when it's not easy to collect some information, proxy data can be used, but indeed proxy data has a lower reliability, so the whole system may have a reduced reliability. In doing so, we must also consider that from the one hand, we can exactly collect the issues of the inventory, for example, the kilograms of fertilizer used per hectares, but after doing so, all the downstream process is modeled through models that indeed relies on scientific evidence, but unfortunately all models have a certain degree of errors. And each of these models may have a variable degree. So some of the impact categories and some of the contribution of each of these impact category may be not so high reliable. Some other can be very high reliable. For example, the effect of the use of the issues that we put in the inventory has a very high reliability in the global warming potential. So we have a very good idea of what we are doing in the global warming potential. We don't have a similar idea on other aspects indeed. Lastly, we must also consider that all these impact indicators should be used for the area of protection indicator, but we must also consider the cost, either economic or other kind of cost. In considering this cost, we must take into account that the availability of a system to survive strongly depends on its cost, frequently and unfortunately almost irrespectively of its environmental impact, unless some laws protect the environment. Well, when collecting this data for the land use change, the cultivation phase, the transport and the transformation, and if we scale this data at a global level, for the 100% of the greenhouse gas emission emitted, we must consider that the most important part is the cultivation phase. These also include the production of the farm input. And as you can see, I also added the land use change. Land use change is a particular aspect of the impact that it's not the production of the farm input. Land use change is the effect of degradation of the land that we do when we convert the land from forest or natural grassland to cultivation, or indeed cultivation and rearing when livestock occurs. In doing so, we degrade the soil through the tillage operation, but we do it irrespective of any production that we produce. Indeed, some kind of crops, just like fruits and vegetables, has a high impact in the transport because frequently the transport of these crops is made in cold conditions, in refrigerated conditions. And lastly, we must also consider that these data are provided as 100% of the total impact from farm input, cultivation, production of farm machinery, transport, transformation, distribution, and use. I didn't add the waste management, but let's consider that the very most of this effect come from the cultivation phase. Indeed, this is an example with the greenhouse gas emission, but something similar occurs for many other categories and so on. These imply that the way we produce, the impact of our production, the amount of yield from our area, and the transport of foods and other agricultural goods also consist in an exploitation of the impact. If in Europe, for example, I use some crop that has managed, has impacted the environment in the United States or in Brazil, I am using it through the transportation, so at a certain extent I am responsible for its environmental impact, but the people making the agricultural production is the direct responsible of their environmental impact. So that the transfer of foods and other agricultural goods at a global extent requires a dialogue among nations and a collective responsibility on the impact in the environment. Similar example can be seen, for example, in the uh, amount of water used for irrigation. When we use it to produce a crop in a given nation, but we use the food from that crop in another nation, we are impacting the environment in the agricultural stage, and the responsibility partly goes to the final end users indeed. So please follow the SHARInG-MeD activities and follow us for additional information on how to compute the life cycle assessment and how to integrate it with the availability of crops to be grown. Thank you.